Welcome back to the world of Ikard, where we learn how to think like the College Board. Today we're covering topics 7.4 and 7.5. World War I transformed the global economic landscape. The United States, who joined the Allies towards the end of the war, emerged as the world's richest economy. In order to help rebuild Europe, the US provided loans to European countries, especially Germany, through the Dawes Plan, which helped it to keep up with the heavy reparations payments required by the Treaty of Versailles. The US economy boomed in the 1920s, largely based on mass consumerism fueled by credit. Overproduction occurred in both agricultural and industrial sectors, and when the stock market crash occurred in 1929, the economy went into rapid freefall, leading to the Great Depression. American banks were no longer able to supply loans to Europe, cutting short their economic recovery and bringing them into crisis. Unemployment rose to new, dangerous heights, most notably in the US and Germany, reaching up to 30%. Governments passed protectionist tariffs, fees on foreign imports, to protect their own domestic production. This, of course, led to a decline in exports for every industrialized country, which led to a further spiral of increasing unemployment, reduced demand, and falling prices. As for the unindustrialized parts of the world, including European overseas colonies and independent nations in Latin America, you should recall from 6.4 that they specialized in exporting commodities. Some examples are cocoa from the British Gold Coast, rubber from the Dutch East Indies, and coffee from Brazil. Prices in all these commodities and many others around the world fell substantially, causing these export economies to also go into economic crisis. Mass unemployment, collapse in banking institutions, declines in commodity prices, and widespread protectionism meant world trade declined by over 60%. Governments around the world responded in a variety of ways, but for the most part they all demonstrated greater government involvement in the economy. In the US, Franklin Roosevelt initiated the New Deal program, which focused on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief meant providing economic and material assistance to the unemployed with cash payments. Recovery was about stimulating economic growth through government spending and job creation, including on building infrastructure. Reform was about creating laws that addressed the inherent problems in the financial system that had caused the problems in the first place, as well as creating long-lasting social welfare programs like Social Security. All of this required deficit spending, the government borrowing money to stimulate the economy. Economic historians still debate how effective the New Deal program was, but it certainly led to a greater involvement of the government in the US economy. Another College Board example is the fascist corporatist economy. Fascism was a new ideology that began in Italy under Benito Mussolini in the 1920s. In the 1930s in Germany, the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler was also what most consider essentially fascist. Fascism was presented as the third way, an alternative to both liberal democracy and to communism. We'll talk more about fascists and especially the Nazis in topic 7.6, causes of World War II. According to fascism, the state is supreme, and everything else exists to serve the state, including the economy. Corporatism views the state as a metaphorical body, and all sectors of the economy and society are organs of the state, and expected to work together to function properly. Sectors of society and the economy were organized into corporations, not to be confused with what we know as corporations, like Apple or Walmart. These corporations were more like guilds, representing certain sectors, such as the steel industry, for example. These were also somewhat similar to labor unions that we talked about in topic 5.8, but with important differences. Labor unions were about protecting the rights of the workers against the exploitation of employers. But fascist corporations included both workers and employers, and was intended to promote class harmony and, most importantly, complete devotion to the goals of the state. Nazi Germany didn't exactly follow this model, but had similar goals of suppressing class conflict and supreme devotion to the state. For example, there was the German Labor Front, a state-run organization that collaborated with industrial companies and also claimed to represent the interests of the workers, but also making it illegal for the workers to go on strike. Nazi Germany's response to the Depression included massive public works projects, famously the construction of the German Autobahn and the facilities for the 1936 Berlin Olympics. But the biggest state investments in Nazi Germany were in the military. Mass production of tanks, military aircraft, and other weaponry stimulated the industrial sector, benefiting the factory owners and providing many industrial jobs. The massive increase in the amount of soldiers was an even more direct way to reduce unemployment, which dropped from 6 million to only 500,000. Other responses to the Great Depression varied around the world. In Mexico, for example, the PRI party, under the leadership of Lázaro Cárdenas, enacted land redistribution reforms that had been advocated by the Zapatistas during the Mexican Revolution, distributing millions of hectares of land to peasants in communal farms called ejidos. This was a significant change to the prevailing Western capitalist idea of private property, and a reversal of what had occurred under the Diaz regime before the revolution. Another major reform was the nationalization of the oil industry, which had previously been dominated by American companies. Mexico also passed tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing. Now, the Soviet Union's 5-year plans. By the late 1920s, the country was firmly under the control of Joseph Stalin, who had two main goals for the economy: rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. To pursue these goals, Stalin enacted ambitious 5-year targets, which were promoted with relentless Soviet propaganda that presented these efforts as a national struggle. As for industrialization, the first 5-year plan was largely successful. For example, the amount of industrial workers nearly tripled, going from 5th in the world to 2nd. Electricity generation, steel and coal production, and other forms of heavy industry were rapidly growing. But there were serious costs to the 5-year plans, especially in agriculture. Stalin's government believed that the best way to increase agricultural production was collectivization, gathering up small-scale farms into large state-owned farms that used industrial machinery. Many of these peasants, called kulaks by Stalin, resisted giving up their farms. Stalin viewed this as clinging to private property, which had been successfully abolished in the rest of Soviet society. To enforce their cooperation, repressive policies were used, including sending people to gulags, forced labor camps where many died from the miserable conditions. Also, production of grain did not reach their overly ambitious targets, yet grain was still forcibly collected and then sold to help finance industrialization efforts. The results on agricultural communities were catastrophic, leading to the Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933, in which several million people died. Famine was especially severe in Ukraine, which lost around 10% of its population, and Kazakhstan, which lost a staggering 40% of its people. The second 5-year plan had more mixed results, with less success in industrial goals, but less catastrophic effects on agriculture. The third 5-year plan was about war preparation, and included mass production of armaments, such as tanks and artillery. It was cut short in 1941 when the Germans invaded the USSR. Now, 7.5. Unresolved tensions after World War I. Here's the required content. The first part is about how Western and Japanese imperial powers did not give up their colonial possessions. In fact, they expanded their empires further through two ways: conquest and treaties. Let's start with treaties, which occurred at the end of World War I. The big one was the Treaty of Versailles, which, in addition to punishing Germany with reparations and disarmament, also transferred ownership of its African colonies to Britain, France, and Belgium as League of Nations mandates. It also recognized Japanese imperial claims to former German colonies in Asia. The League of Nations was the idea of US President Woodrow Wilson, and had the goals of promoting world peace and solving international problems through diplomacy and cooperation. The US never joined the League of Nations, but by the mid-1920s, most of the world's great powers had. However, it was largely dominated by Britain and France. And in case you forgot, the British and French were very enthusiastic about imperialism. There was also the Treaty of Lausanne, which dismantled most of the Ottoman Empire and provided more League of Nations mandates to Britain and France in the Middle East. Officially, these mandates were supposed to be different than colonies, and were on a path towards self-determination whenever they were deemed ready to rule themselves. In practice, however, these new territories were exploited just like other colonies. Now, conquests. First, the Japanese, whose territorial ambitions led them to be ever more aggressive, specifically in China. After the Russo-Japanese War, Japan had established a sphere of influence over Manchuria, northeastern China. In 1931, Japan officially seized it and created a puppet state called Manchukuo, installing the last Qing emperor as a puppet leader. Manchuria was rich in important mineral resources, and Japan considered it an essential part of their empire. The League of Nations used its verbal sanctions to tell Japan to stop, and almost no other state recognized the legitimacy of Manchukuo. But Japan continued, and then decided to leave the League of Nations. By 1937, Japanese expansion led to full-scale invasion of China. Another example was fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The League of Nations had declared this to be illegal, but as in the case of Japan in Manchuria, there was not much that the League could do about it. Italy left the League in 1937. Lastly, we have to mention anti-colonial resistance. In China in 1919, the May 4th movement protests occurred in opposition to the transfer of Germany's possessions in China to Japanese ownership. The same year in India, British colonial soldiers killed hundreds of peaceful protesters in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, triggering more anti-British resistance. The Indian National Congress, which was previously composed of British-educated Indian elites advocating moderate reforms, evolved into a mass movement advocating full-scale independence. Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru emerged as major nationalist leaders, advocating non-violent resistance to British rule. We'll see more of Gandhi, Nehru, and much more anti-colonial resistance in Unit 8. That's all for 7.4 and 7.5. We'll see you next time for World War II.